I hid behind the mask they gave me, until I tore it off. You want to know the truth. The real, unfiltered truth. I've been suffocating behind a smile for so long that I forgot what my actual face looked like underneath. Those were the first words that came tumbling out of my mouth that Tuesday morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, mascara streaking down my cheeks like black rivers of surrender. I didn't even know I was going to say them until they escaped, raw and desperate, into the suffocating silence of my perfectly curated life. My name is Delphine Crawford, and until that moment, I had been living as everyone else's masterpiece. You see, they handed me the mask when I was 7 years old, sitting in the principal's office after defending my friend Jamie from the class bullies. My mother's manicured fingers gripped my small shoulders as she whispered urgently in my ear, "Good girls don't cause trouble, Delphine. Good girls smile and say please and thank you and never, ever make waves." The mask felt foreign at first, like wearing someone else's skin, but everyone praised me for how well it fit. Such a sweet child, they would coo. So well behaved. So agreeable. And so I learned to wear it perfectly. By high school, the mask had molded to my features so seamlessly that I couldn't tell where it ended, and I began. I was the girl who said yes to every request, who laughed at jokes that made my stomach turn, who dated the boy my friends thought was perfect even though his touch made me feel hollow inside. I was valedictorian not because I loved learning, but because excellence was expected. I was prom queen not because I wanted the crown, but because it looked good on the mask. College was supposed to be different. College was supposed to be freedom. But I packed that mask carefully in my suitcase, wrapped in tissue paper like a family heirloom, and wore it to every party, every study group, every late-night conversation in the dorms. I majored in business because my father said it was practical, even though my heart yearned for poetry and paint-stained fingers and the messy beauty of creating something from nothing. I joined a sorority because my mother had been in one, pledging my allegiance to a sisterhood that felt more like a carefully choreographed performance. Delphine is such a team player, my professors would write in recommendation letters. Reliable, pleasant, and always willing to go the extra mile. What they didn't see was the girl who cried herself to sleep every night, feeling like she was drowning in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt like a prison on the inside. The mask grew heavier after graduation. I took a job at a prestigious marketing firm in Manhattan, not because I was passionate about selling products to people who didn't need them, but because it impressed everyone at cocktail parties. I rented an apartment I couldn't afford in the right neighborhood, wore clothes that felt like costumes, and smiled until my cheeks ached at networking events where I pretended to care about quarterly projections and brand synergy. I dated men who looked good on paper but left me feeling empty. First there was Bradley, the investment banker with the perfect smile and the wandering eyes. Then came Theodore, the lawyer who treated me like an accessory to his ambitions. Finally there was Jonathan, who proposed to me with a ring the size of a marble in front of a restaurant full of strangers who applauded while I felt my soul shrink a little smaller. "You're so lucky," my friends would gush. "He's perfect for you." But perfect for whom? Perfect for the mask, certainly. Perfect for the image I had spent 25 years cultivating. But what about the girl underneath? The one who dreamed of traveling to small villages in Tuscany and painting watercolors of sunsets? What about the woman who wanted to write stories that mattered? Who yearned for a love that felt like coming home rather than putting on a performance? The engagement party was a turning point, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I stood in my parents' perfectly manicured backyard, surrounded by people congratulating me on my good fortune, wearing a dress that cost more than some people's rent and a smile that felt painted on. Jonathan's hand rested possessively on the small of my back as he regaled our guests with the story of his elaborate proposal, each detail crafted to sound romantic but feeling increasingly hollow with each retelling. "Tell them about the ring shopping," my future mother-in-law urged, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a successful social climber. "How you knew exactly what our Delphine would want." The truth was, Jonathan had never asked what I wanted. He had consulted with my mother, studied my Pinterest board, and selected the ring that would photograph best for social media. It was beautiful, certainly, and expensive, but it felt like wearing someone else's dream on my finger. That night, I found myself standing on my apartment balcony, staring out at the city lights and feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The ring caught the reflection of the streetlights below, throwing tiny rainbows across my face, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at my own prison sentence. The mask had grown so heavy I could barely hold my head up anymore. The cracks started small. A moment of hesitation before agreeing to yet another social obligation. A flash of irritation when someone made a decision about my life without consulting me. A growing sense of suffocation when I looked in the mirror and couldn't recognize the person staring back at me. My friends began to notice. "You seem different lately," my college roommate Melissa observed over brunch one Saturday. "More distant." How could I explain that I was trying to remember who I used to be? That every morning I had to consciously put on a personality the way other people put on makeup? That I had become so skilled at being what everyone else wanted that I had lost track of what I wanted for myself? The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday in October. I was sitting in a conference room listening to my boss pitch a campaign for a luxury handbag company, when something inside me simply snapped. The words coming out of his mouth, about empowering women through consumer choices, about the transformative power of owning the right accessories, suddenly sounded like static. I looked around the table at my colleagues, all nodding enthusiastically, all playing their assigned roles in this elaborate theater, and I realized I couldn't breathe. I excused myself and rushed to the bathroom, my hands shaking as I gripped the cold porcelain of the sink. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, I saw myself clearly for the first time in years. The carefully contoured makeup, the professionally styled hair, the designer blazer that cost more than my first car. All of it felt like an elaborate costume I had forgotten how to take off. That was when the words came tumbling out, desperate and raw and more honest than anything I had said in years. "You want to know the truth. The real, unfiltered truth. I've been suffocating behind a smile for so long that I forgot what my actual face looked like underneath." And in that moment, standing in that sterile bathroom with my reflection staring back at me like an accusation, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done. Done pretending that someone else's dreams were mine. Done smiling at jokes that weren't funny. Done wearing clothes that felt like armor. Done dating a man I didn't love just because he looked good on paper. Done living a life that felt like sleepwalking through someone else's movie. I walked back into that conference room and did something I had never done before in my professional life. I spoke my truth. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice cutting through my boss's presentation like a knife through silk. 20 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, some shocked, some disapproving, all confused by this sudden crack in my perfect facade. "Excuse me." My boss's eyebrows had disappeared somewhere near his hairline. "This campaign. This job. This life." The words were coming faster now, like water through a broken dam. "I can't pretend anymore that selling overpriced handbags to insecure women is meaningful work. I can't sit here nodding along while we discuss the best way to exploit people's deepest fears about not being good enough." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the collective intake of breath, the mental calculation of career suicide, the whispered conversations that would follow me for months. But for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, ignoring the concerned glances and hushed conversations that followed me through the office. My hands shook as I packed my few personal belongings. A plant that had somehow survived years of neglect, a photo of my college friends before we all became strangers wearing professional masks, a notebook full of story ideas I had never been brave enough to pursue. The hardest conversation was with Jonathan. I found him at his apartment that evening, celebrating what he assumed was a promotion at work with a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than most people's groceries for a month. "Darling." He swept me into an embrace that felt like being hugged by a mannequin. "I heard you had some excitement at work today. Did you finally get that account you've been chasing?" I looked at this man I was supposed to marry, this person who knew so little about my inner life that he couldn't even recognize my emotional crisis as anything other than professional drama, and I felt a profound sadness settle over me. "I quit my job today," I said simply. The champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. "You what?" Why would you do that? We have a wedding to pay for, Delphine. We have plans. We have your plans, I corrected gently. I just realized I don't remember making any of my own. What followed was not a conversation so much as a negotiation, with Jonathan trying to convince me that I was having some sort of breakdown, that I just needed a vacation, that everything would look better in the morning. He talked about our future as if it were a business merger, all logistics and practical considerations and mutual benefits. But nowhere in his 20-minute monologue did he ask how I felt. Nowhere did he wonder what I wanted. Nowhere did he show any curiosity about the woman he claimed to love enough to spend the rest of his life with. I took off the engagement ring and placed it gently on his coffee table, next to the champagne bottle and the wedding magazines we had never actually looked at together. I can't marry you, I said, and the words felt like taking off shoes that had been too tight for too long. I can't marry anyone until I figure out who I actually am underneath all this. He didn't fight for me. He didn't ask me to reconsider or beg me to stay. He asked about the deposits we had put down on venues, about the save-the-date cards we had already sent, about what he was supposed to tell his parents. I walked away from that conversation feeling lighter than I had in years, even as my heart broke a little for the girl who had thought that kind of love was all she deserved. The next few months were the most terrifying and exhilarating of my life. I moved out of my expensive apartment and into a tiny studio in Brooklyn, a space so small I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched, but it was mine in a way that nowhere had ever been mine before. I painted the walls a color I loved, a deep, rich blue that reminded me of the ocean at twilight, and hung curtains I had sewn myself from fabric I found at a flea market. The first night in that apartment, I sat on the floor eating Chinese takeout straight from the container, surrounded by boxes I was almost afraid to unpack. What if there wasn't enough of the real me to fill even this tiny space? What if, underneath all the performance, I was actually empty? But as the weeks passed, something magical began to happen. I discovered I had preferences I'd never acknowledged. I loved the smell of old books and burning candles. I preferred warm lighting to harsh overheads. I enjoyed the sound of rain against windows and the feeling of thick socks on hardwood floors. These seemed like small revelations, but they felt monumental. Proof that underneath the mask, there had always been a real person waiting to emerge. I cut my hair short, not because it was fashionable, but because I was tired of spending an hour every morning making it look like someone else's idea of professional beauty. The hairdresser, a woman with purple streaks and kind eyes, asked me 3 times if I was sure. "Honey, this is a big change," she said, running her fingers through my shoulder-length waves. "You sure you're not gonna regret this tomorrow?" "I've been regretting everything else for years," I told her. "It's time to try something different." When she spun my chair around to face the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The short, tousled cut made my eyes look bigger, my cheekbones more pronounced. But more than that, it made me look like someone who might have opinions, who might take risks, who might not apologize for taking up space. I cleaned out my closet, donating bags full of clothes that had never felt like me, keeping only the pieces that made me feel like myself, whoever that turned out to be. The process was both liberating and heartbreaking. Each blazer I folded into a donation bag represented years of pretending to be someone else. Each pair of uncomfortable heels told the story of a woman who had prioritized other people's expectations of femininity over her own comfort. The money ran out faster than I had anticipated. Without my 6-figure salary, my savings account dwindled with alarming speed. There were nights when I lay awake calculating how many weeks I could survive on ramen noodles and library books, wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. The job search was humbling in ways I hadn't expected. My resume, impressive as it looked on paper, meant nothing when I couldn't explain why I had walked away from it all. Potential employers would look at me with confusion, then suspicion, then polite dismissal. One particularly brutal interview ended with the hiring manager asking if I was having some kind of personal crisis that might affect my work performance. "Yes," I said, surprising us both with my honesty. "I'm having a crisis of authenticity. I'm trying to figure out who I actually am when I'm not pretending to be who everyone else wants me to be." He didn't call back. Eventually, I took a part-time job at a bookstore in the village, earning less in a month than I used to spend on dinner, but waking up each morning with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt since childhood. The bookstore, between the lines, was owned by an elderly Jewish woman named Ruth who had survived the Holocaust and seemed to see through people's facades with laser precision. "You're running from something," she observed on my third day, watching me reorganize the poetry section with unnecessary intensity. "Running toward something, actually," I corrected. She nodded approvingly. "Better. Running toward is much more exhausting, but it's honest work." Ruth became an unexpected mentor, teaching me that authenticity wasn't just about shedding false selves. It was about having the courage to discover and nurture what was real. She would assign me books I'd never heard of, authors who wrote about transformation and truth-telling and the messy business of becoming human. "Read this," she would say, pressing a slim volume into my hands. "This woman understands something about the price of pretending." The customers were a revelation too. Without the pressure to network or impress, I found myself having genuine conversations with strangers about books and life and the stories we tell ourselves. A teenager struggling with her identity would confide her fears about disappointing her parents. A middle-aged man going through a divorce would ask for recommendations about starting over. An elderly woman would share memories triggered by the cover of a book she'd loved 50 years ago. These interactions felt more meaningful than any I'd had in years of professional networking. There was no agenda, no performance, just human beings connecting over the messy, complicated business of being alive. My family's reaction was predictable. My mother called daily, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that comes from watching your child make choices that don't fit the script you've written for their life. "This is just a phase," she would insist. "Everyone goes through a quarter-life crisis. But you can't throw away everything you've worked for because you're having doubts." The conversations became increasingly strained. She would update me on Jonathan's new relationship. How happy he seemed, how quickly he was moving on, how his new girlfriend was so much more stable, as if this information would make me regret my choices. Instead, it only confirmed that I had made the right decision. My father was more direct. "You're being selfish, Delphine. Do you have any idea what you've put Jonathan through? What you've put this family through? We raised you better than this." During one particularly difficult phone call, I finally found the courage to push back. "You raised me to be what you thought I should be," I said, my voice shaking but determined. "You raised me to be agreeable and successful and presentable. But you never asked what I wanted to be." The silence that followed stretched for so long I thought the call had disconnected. "We wanted you to be happy," my mother finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "No," I said gently. "You wanted me to look happy. There's a difference." That conversation marked a turning point. My parents still called, still worried, still occasionally tried to convince me to return to my old life, but there was a new wariness in their voices, as if they were beginning to understand that their daughter had fundamentally changed in ways they couldn't simply wish away. The loneliness was perhaps the hardest part of the transformation. I had built a social life around shared performances, and when I stopped performing, many of those relationships simply evaporated. Invitations stopped coming. Text messages went unanswered. Former friends would run into me at coffee shops and make polite conversation before hurrying away, as if authenticity might be contagious. But what they couldn't understand, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that they had raised me to be what they thought I should be, not who I actually was. They had given me tools for living someone else's life, and now I was trying to learn how to live my own. The hardest part wasn't the financial struggle or the family disappointment or even the loneliness that came from shedding relationships that had been built on a false foundation. The hardest part was learning to trust my own voice after years of drowning it out with other people's expectations. Some days, the silence of my authentic voice was deafening. I would sit in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my new life. Paint supplies I was too scared to use, notebooks full of story fragments I was too insecure to develop, contact information for writing groups I was too intimidated to join, and wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. Who was I to think I had something valuable to say? Who was I to believe that my authentic self was worth all this upheaval? The voices of doubt sounded suspiciously like all the people I had spent my life trying to please, whispering that I was being selfish, impractical, naive. I started small. I chose what to eat based on what I was actually craving, not what seemed healthy or appropriate or photogenic. I said no to social events that felt draining and yes to afternoon walks through the park just because the light looked beautiful through the trees. I bought books based on what intrigued me, not what I thought I should be reading. The process was slower and more difficult than I had anticipated. After decades of automatic responses, every choice required conscious consideration. What did I actually want for lunch? What did I really think about that movie? How did I honestly feel about that person's comment? The mental energy required was exhausting, but also exhilarating. I started keeping a journal, not the gratitude practice productivity-focused type I had maintained before, but a messy, stream of consciousness exploration of my thoughts and feelings. The early entries were painful to read. So much anger and confusion and grief for the life I had wasted, so much fear about the uncertain future I was choosing. But gradually, other voices began to emerge on those pages. Curiosity about what I might create if I stopped censoring myself. Excitement about experiences I had never allowed myself to want. Hope that somewhere in the mess of transformation, I might find something worth keeping. Slowly, carefully, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness, I began to discover who Delphine Crawford actually was underneath all the masks. She was messier than I had expected, and more emotional. She cried during commercials and laughed too loudly at movies and had strong opinions about things that didn't matter. She liked her coffee black and her music loud and her Friday nights spent reading in bed with takeout from the Thai place around the corner. She was also more creative than the mask had ever allowed her to be. I started carrying a small sketchpad, drawing the faces of subway passengers and the architecture of fire escapes and the way light fell through the bookstore windows at different times of day. My drawings were terrible by any objective standard, but they were mine in a way that nothing had been mine in years. She was politically passionate in ways that surprised me. Without the need to maintain professional neutrality, I found myself with strong opinions about income inequality and environmental justice and the way society treated women who refused to perform conventional femininity. I started attending protests and town halls, adding my voice to causes I cared about instead of staying safely silent. She was also braver than I had given her credit for. 6 months after I quit my job, I enrolled in a creative writing program at a community college. The first day of class, I sat in a circle of strangers and read a story I had written about a woman who forgot how to recognize her own reflection. My voice shook, my hands trembled, and I was certain that everyone would see through me, would recognize me as a fraud who had no business calling herself a writer. The classroom was in the basement of an old building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs arranged in a circle like some kind of support group. Which, in a way, it was. We were all there for the same reason. Because we had stories burning inside us that we were finally brave enough to tell. There was Miguel, a construction worker who wrote poetry about his grandfather's hands. Jennifer, a nurse who crafted stories about the secrets patients whispered in hospital corridors. Robert, a recently retired accountant who was finally giving himself permission to explore the science fiction novels he'd been dreaming about for 40 years. When my turn came to read, I had written what I thought was a simple story about a woman shopping for makeup who realizes she doesn't recognize her own face in the department store mirror. But as the words left my mouth, I realized I was telling my own story, disguised as fiction. Instead, something magical happened. People leaned forward as I read, their faces reflecting the emotions I had poured onto the page. When I finished, a woman across the circle wiped tears from her eyes. "That was beautiful," she said simply. "And so true." Jennifer, the nurse, nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," she said. "Looking at yourself and not recognizing who's looking back." For the first time in my life I felt seen. Not admired for my performance or appreciated for my usefulness, but truly seen for the messy, complicated, imperfect person I actually was. The writing workshops became my sanctuary. Every Tuesday evening, I would descend into that basement classroom and spend 2 hours in the company of people who understood that stories mattered, that truth-telling was both necessary and terrifying, that the act of putting authentic words on paper was a kind of rebellion against a world that preferred comfortable lies. Our teacher, Professor Martinez, was a small woman with silver hair and fierce eyes who had been writing and teaching for 30 years. She had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of what we were really trying to say. "What are you afraid to write?" she asked during our third class. "What's the story you think you're not allowed to tell?" The question haunted me for weeks. What was I afraid to write? The answer, when it came, was simple and terrifying. Everything. I was afraid to write about the suffocation of perfectionism, the prison of other people's expectations, the way women are taught to make themselves smaller to make others more comfortable. I was afraid to write about the loneliness of living behind a mask, the grief of losing relationships built on false foundations, the terror and joy of starting over at 30. But fear, I was learning, was often a compass pointing toward what needed to be written most urgently. The writing class led to other classes. Poetry workshops where I learned to distill emotions into their purest form. Art classes where I covered my hands in paint and created images that came from some deep, wordless place inside me. Theater improv sessions where I practiced being spontaneous, where I learned that not every response had to be carefully calculated for maximum approval. The art class was particularly transformative. I hadn't touched paint since elementary school. Had been taught that creative pursuits were hobbies at best, distractions from more important work at worst. But standing in front of a blank canvas with a palette of colors I had chosen myself, I felt a freedom I hadn't experienced since childhood. My paintings were abstract, emotional explosions of color that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Blue waves of sadness crashed into yellow bursts of joy. Red anger swirled around purple confusion. I painted my feelings instead of analyzing them, let my intuition guide my brush instead of trying to create something that would impress others. The other students in the class were a mix of retirees exploring long-suppressed artistic impulses and younger people using creativity as therapy for various life transitions. We would stand in front of each other's work, offering observations and encouragement, learning to see beauty in imperfection and authenticity in amateur technique. "You paint like someone who has a lot to say," observed Elena, an older woman whose own canvases were covered in intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories about her childhood in Mexico. "But also like someone who is just learning to say it." She was right. I was learning a new language. The language of expressing myself without apology, without editing, without concern for whether the result would be palatable to others. The improv classes pushed me even further outside my comfort zone. Standing in front of strangers, asked to react spontaneously to unpredictable scenarios, was terrifying for someone who had spent decades carefully scripting her responses to the world. Yes and was the fundamental rule of improv, and it became a philosophy that extended beyond the classroom. Instead of my default response of analyzing whether something was appropriate or beneficial or aligned with my image, I learned to say yes to experiences and see where they led. Yes to the late-night conversations with classmates that stretched until dawn. Yes to the poetry reading in a coffee shop basement where I was invited to share my work. Yes to the weekend trip to a writer's retreat in the mountains where I knew no one and had no agenda beyond seeing what might emerge. I made new friends. Real friends, who knew the person I was becoming rather than the person I had been pretending to be. There was Luna, a photographer who taught me to see beauty in abandoned buildings and subway graffiti. Marcus, a poet who showed me that vulnerability could be a kind of strength. Elena, a dancer who moved through the world with a freedom I envied and eventually learned to emulate. These friendships felt different from any I had known before. There was no competition, no careful management of image, no exhausting performance of perfection. We saw each other's flaws and loved each other anyway. Or maybe because of them. When I told them about my former life, they listened with curiosity rather than judgment, asking questions that helped me understand my own journey rather than trying to fix or change me. "What was it like?" Luna asked one evening as we shared wine and takeout in my tiny apartment, "to wake up one day and realize you'd been living someone else's life?" "Terrifying," I said honestly. Like waking up in someone else's body and trying to figure out how to make it feel like home. But also liberating, Marcus suggested. Eventually, I agreed. But first it was just empty. Like I had spent so many years filling myself up with other people's expectations that when I emptied them out, I wasn't sure there was anything left. And now? Lena asked. I looked around my small apartment, at the walls I had painted the color of ocean twilight, at the paintings I had created with my own hands, at the books I had chosen because they called to something authentic in me, at the faces of friends who accepted me exactly as I was. Now I'm discovering that there was always someone real underneath, I said. She was just buried under a lot of other people's ideas about who she should be. My old friends had mostly faded away, unable to connect with this new version of me who no longer laughed at their casual cruelties or went along with their elaborate social hierarchies. The few who remained had to adjust to a Delphine who might disagree with them, who had opinions that didn't always align with theirs, who was no longer willing to be the agreeable backdrop to their more dramatic lives. "You've changed," my former college roommate Melissa said during one of our increasingly rare coffee dates. She said it like an accusation, like change was inherently a betrayal of our friendship. I have, I agreed, and for the first time that didn't sound like an apology. The romantic relationships came more slowly. After Jonathan, I was gun-shy about dating, afraid that I would fall back into old patterns of becoming what someone else wanted rather than staying true to myself. But eventually, I met David at a poetry reading in the East Village. He had kind eyes and paint under his fingernails, and he listened. Really listened. When I talked about the stories I was trying to write. Our first kiss happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Washington Square Park. Spontaneous and perfect, and nothing like the carefully orchestrated romantic moments I had experienced before. He tasted like coffee and possibility, and when he looked at me afterward, I felt like he was seeing all of me. Not just the polished surface, but the messy, complicated truth underneath. "I like you," he said simply. And those 3 words meant more to me than all of Jonathan's elaborate declarations of love. Dating David was like learning a new language. The language of authentic intimacy. He wanted to know what I thought about books and movies and the meaning of life. He was curious about my fears and dreams and the stories I told myself when I couldn't sleep. He loved my messy hair in the morning and the way I sang off-key in the shower and the fact that I cried during sad commercials. Most importantly, he didn't try to fix me or improve me or mold me into his ideal partner. He seemed to genuinely enjoy the person I was in the process of becoming. "You know what I love about you," he said one evening as we walked along the Hudson River, the lights of New Jersey twinkling across the water. "You're not trying to be anyone else. You're just you." It was such a simple observation, but it hit me like a revelation. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't performing being Delphine Crawford. I was just being her. The career transformation took longer, and it was messier than I had hoped. Freelance writing paid sporadically and poorly, and there were months when I survived on ramen noodles and library books, and the kindness of friends who believed in my talent more than I did. I wrote articles for websites that paid pennies per word and submitted stories to literary magazines that sent back form rejection letters with devastating regularity. The rejection letters were particularly brutal in the beginning. Each one felt like confirmation that I had been delusional to think I had anything valuable to say, that I should have stayed in my safe, well-paying job and kept my authentic voice locked away where it couldn't embarrass anyone. But Ruth from the bookstore had different ideas. She would find me slumped behind the counter after particularly discouraging days, reading rejection letters and questioning every choice that had led me to this point. "You know what rejection letters mean?" she would ask, taking the crumpled paper from my hands and smoothing it out. "That I'm not good enough. That you're trying. That you're putting yourself out there. That you're brave enough to risk being told no." She would fold the rejection letter carefully and hand it back to me. I have a shoebox full of rejection letters from when I tried to publish my memoir about surviving the camps. You know what I learned? The magazines that rejected me weren't the right fit. But the one that finally said yes. That was the beginning of everything. Her faith in me was unwavering, even when mine faltered. She would hand me books by authors who had struggled for years before finding their audiences. Stories of writers who had been rejected dozens of times before publishing work that changed the world. Persistence is a form of courage, she would say. And authenticity is a form of rebellion. Keep rebelling. Slowly, gradually, my work began to find its audience. A personal essay about learning to live authentically was picked up by a mid-tier online publication after being rejected by 7 others. The comments section exploded with responses from readers who recognized themselves in my story, who shared their own experiences of living behind masks they were afraid to remove. "Thank you for writing this," one commenter said. "I've been pretending to love my job, my relationship, even my hobbies for so long that I forgot what actually brings me joy. Your story gave me permission to start asking myself what I really want." Another wrote, "I'm 45 years old and just realized I've never made a major life decision based on what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I should want. This is terrifying and inspiring in equal measure." The response was overwhelming. My inbox filled with messages from strangers who wanted to share their own stories of transformation, who were considering their own journeys toward authenticity, who needed encouragement to take the first scary steps away from lives that looked perfect but felt empty. A short story about inherited trauma won a small literary contest, earning me $500 and, more importantly, validation that my voice mattered. A piece about the performance of femininity in professional settings sparked conversations I never expected, being shared across social media platforms and generating responses from women in corporate environments around the world. "You put words to something I've been feeling for years but couldn't articulate," one woman wrote. "The exhaustion of being professional, when what that really means is making yourself smaller and quieter, and more palatable to men who mistake our accommodation for incompetence." Another said, "I printed your essay and taped it to my bathroom mirror. Every morning when I put on my work face, I read it and remember that there's a real person underneath all the performance." People began to reach out. Other women who recognized themselves in my stories, who had their own masks they were tired of wearing, who were searching for permission to live more honestly. Editors started contacting me directly, asking if I had other pieces that explored similar themes. My rates increased slowly but steadily as my reputation grew. "Your essay saved my life," one stranger wrote in an email that made me cry. "I've been pretending to be someone else for so long that I forgot who I actually was. Reading about your journey gave me courage to start my own." This was the kind of work I had been searching for without knowing it. Work that connected, that mattered, that helped other people feel less alone in their struggles to be authentic in a world that rewarded performance over truth. Each response confirmed that I wasn't alone in my experience, that the prison of perfectionism and people-pleasing was more common than anyone wanted to admit. 2 years after that breakdown in the corporate bathroom, I published my first collection of essays. The Weight of Masks: Learning to Live Authentically in an Inauthentic World. The book launch was held at the same bookstore where I had worked part-time, surrounded by the same friends who had watched me stumble through my transformation with patience and love. My parents came, looking slightly bewildered but proud despite themselves. My mother had read the book twice, she told me, and while she didn't agree with all my choices, she was beginning to understand why I had made them. "I never realized how unhappy you were," she said quietly during the reception, her carefully controlled composure cracking slightly. "I thought we were giving you everything you needed to succeed." "You were," I assured her. "You gave me tools for a certain kind of success. I just needed different tools for a different kind of life." Jonathan was not there, of course. I had heard through mutual friends that he had married his rebound relationship within a year of our breakup. A woman who fit perfectly into the life he had planned, who wanted the same things he wanted, who didn't question the script they were both following. I genuinely hoped they were happy together. As for me, I was discovering that happiness was more complicated than I had expected, but also more real. There were still difficult days, moments when I missed the simplicity of letting other people make my decisions, times when the freedom of authenticity felt overwhelming rather than liberating. But there was also a kind of peace I had never experienced before. The peace that comes from knowing that the life you're living is actually yours, that the choices you make reflect your true values rather than other people's expectations, that the person you see in the mirror is someone you actually recognize and, increasingly, someone you actually like. The night of the book launch, David and I walked home through the village streets, my head still buzzing with wine and conversation and the surreal reality that strangers had bought copies of my most personal thoughts. "How does it feel?" he asked, squeezing my hand as we navigated around a group of late-night revelers. I considered the question seriously. How did it feel to have spent 2 years peeling back layers of performed personality to find out who was underneath? How did it feel to have lost so much of what I had thought mattered? The prestigious job, the socially acceptable relationship, the approval of people who had known me my whole life. Only to discover that what remained was infinitely more valuable. "Like I can breathe," I said finally, and it was true. For 30 years I had been holding my breath, waiting for permission to be myself, afraid that my true personality wouldn't be acceptable to the people whose approval I craved. Learning to live authentically had required me to risk everything I thought I wanted in order to discover what I actually needed. The mask hadn't come off easily. There had been moments when I wanted to put it back on, when the world felt too harsh and demanding for someone as sensitive and imperfect as the real Delphine turned out to be. There had been times when I missed the simplicity of playing a role, when the complexity of being genuine felt like more responsibility than I could handle. But every time I considered retreating back into performance, something inside me rebelled. I had tasted freedom, and I couldn't go back to prison voluntarily. Now, when I wake up in the morning, I don't have to spend precious energy deciding who to be that day. I don't have to calculate how to respond to every interaction in order to maximize approval. I don't have to perform happiness or success or contentment. I can simply experience whatever I'm actually feeling and trust that it's enough. The woman I am now is more emotional than the mask ever allowed me to be, but she's also more joyful. She cries more easily, but she also laughs with her whole body. She has strong opinions and expresses them without apology. She makes mistakes and owns them instead of deflecting blame. She asks for what she needs instead of hoping someone will guess. She says no to things that don't serve her and yes to adventures that scare her. She is not perfect and she has stopped trying to be. The masks we wear are seductive because they promise safety. If we can just perform the right personality, say the right things, want the right things, then surely we will be loved and accepted and valued. But what I learned, in the most painful and beautiful way possible, is that a love built on performance is not really love at all. It's appreciation for a character you're playing, and the exhaustion of maintaining that character will eventually destroy you from the inside out. The people who matter, the ones worth keeping in your life, will love you more for your authenticity than they ever loved your mask. They will be drawn to your imperfections, delighted by your contradictions, and inspired by your courage to live honestly in a world that rewards deception. And the people who can only love your mask, well, they never really loved you anyway. Standing in that bathroom 2 years ago, staring at my reflection and finally speaking my truth, I thought I was having a breakdown. But I was actually having a breakthrough. Into a life that finally fit, into a skin that was finally my own, into a story that was mine to write. The girl who put on that first mask at 7 years old thought she was protecting herself. The woman who tore it off at 29 realized she had been imprisoning herself instead. These days, when people ask me who I am, I can answer without hesitation. I am Delphine Crawford, writer of uncomfortable truths and lover of authentic moments and believer in the radical act of being exactly who you are, even when, especially when, it scares everyone around you. I am the woman who learned that the most dangerous thing you can do is live someone else's life, and the most courageous thing you can do is live your own. I am no longer hiding behind the mask they gave me. I tore it off and I am never putting it back on again. Thank you for watching today's video. Please do not forget to like, subscribe and share. It really helps us a lot. Thank you.